Welcome everybody, wherever you are. This is our 6th webinar, our final in our part 1 in our higher education digital transformation series. Wow, we were just talking about, we can't believe it's already been 6 and the time has just flown. To date, many of you already know this because you've been joining us, but we've been looking at lots of different facets of higher education digital transformation. But today we're going to look forward at some potential scenarios for the future. We're not using a crystal ball for these projections. This is all driven by data and insights. And this conversation we're having today, the dialogue between this group is really going to be a big driver as this continues to evolve. To take us through the session, we have an amazing oh, sorry, did I click that? Oh, I'll click. We have an amazing HolonIQ team, Lucy, who heads up our digital capability work. Hey, Lucy. And our co-CEOs, Maria Spies and Patrick Brothers. Want to give them an extra shout out, this whole team besides me, because it's very early for them in the morning. So props for waking up very early. My name is Beth Hogan. I run our customer experience team here, and it's really great to see so many members of our client community joining us. Okay, so again, if you've been joining for a lot of these, you already get the drill, but if this is new for you and this is your first time joining, welcome. This whole series, we've been looking at many different facets, anything from micro-credentials to international higher education. This 6th part, we're looking forward, but beyond today, there's still much more to come. We're going to be hearing from global leaders and global digital leaders in part 2, and then from them, we're going to hear from case studies, universities. All of our past sessions are available on YouTube, so definitely check it out, and you can go back and click through all 6 of them. Some quick housekeeping. So everybody always asks, I'll tell you as fast as I can. The session will be recorded and sent to you immediately after it finishes, so don't worry, you'll get it in your inbox right away. Also, participation is so important in this whole thing. So there are a bunch of ways that you can contribute to the dialogue throughout the session. Click on the little arrow on the right side of the screen and you'll have 3 things you can jump into. First of all, chat. Definitely encourage everybody to jump in, introduce yourself, tell us where you're typing from. Next, you can also share questions with the team and we'll do our very best to get back to you directly throughout the session. And then finally, tons of polls. We're definitely going to be getting temperature reads from folks on the call. We've got huge expertise and brain power from 1,000 registrants joining. So definitely do jump in and share your input on polls, even if it's not something you feel like you know the answer to. Input is really important. And if you're not so familiar with HolonIQ, big welcome to you. Really great to see you here. We are the world's leading education market intelligence. We're often known for frameworks and analysis that we do across the education landscape, but we're also used by a client community of leaders in technology, academia, government, investment, and they use our platform to drive long-term strategy and growth and innovation. Okay. Enough about background. We've got 45 minutes and a ton to pack in, so I'm going to jump right into the agenda. First, Lucy's going to take us through the open source framework. She's also going to walk us through the Q2 benchmarking cohort. Then I understand Maria and Pat are going to kind of tag team a lot of the parts after that. They're going to start by walking us through scenarios, but leading up to it, they're going to share a bit of logic and methodology behind the scenarios, an overview of analysis in education in 2030, factors and drivers, and then we're going to do a really deep dive into those 3 scenarios with lots of dialogue throughout. So, without further ado.
Thank you very much, Beth. And hello and welcome everybody. It's awesome seeing all of those countries come up. I can't call them out, but I feel like we've seen some new ones even today compared to the last kind of 12 weeks. Those of you who's been here at every one of the 6 webinars should be experts on this. I toyed with the idea of doing a bit of an audience participation. Who can tell me, who can read back what this framework's all about, but I won't. This has been our underlying framework for certainly all of the webinars and a lot of other work around that in higher education, digital capability. And for those of you who are just joining us for the first time today, and I'm sure who will run back and watch the previous 5 webinars straight away afterwards, let me give you a quick tour of the framework. It's based around the learner lifecycle in higher education. So as you look along those top dimensions there, those 4, starting in demand and discovery, through to learning design, learner experience, and work and lifelong learning. The framework seeks to capture the digital capabilities that an institution needs to be considering and developing all along each of those stages, and particularly with a view to what the learner is experiencing at each of those points. In previous webinars, we've looked at this framework and we've overlaid higher education concepts that we've been exploring onto it. So whether it's micro-credentials or OPMs or MOOCs, we've zoomed in and out of the framework and looked at which bits of it are most applicable. And that's a really useful way to think about how to use the framework. It's been a very interactive process of developing it. And as we've done that, we've seen how many different perspectives people can put on it, such that, you know, any of those 70 colorful boxes underneath could have a lot of different interpretations depending on whether you're a tiny rural community college or a huge 50,000 seat university that's leading in digital in lots of areas. So it's been a great journey so far, and definitely encourage you to keep on sharing feedback about the framework and what you're using it for. Having given you a very brief introduction to that, I'm going to go straight back out to you, not to describe the framework, but to ask you in our first poll, which of those 4 dimensions across the framework has the greatest digital capability gap in your institution from your point of view? So just as a recap, demand and discovery, that covers a lot of the marketing work, processes, recruitment, insights about students. Learning design goes deep into curriculum design and subject matter expertise and media and teaching strategies. Learner experience goes into the campus, whether it's virtual or face-to-face, looking at academic administration, looking at student life and learning experiences. And then work and lifelong learning goes into the careers and workspace, relationships with industry and alumni. So those are the 4 dimensions. We've had a huge amount of conversations, but let's bring it right up to the highest level. I think the poll is live and ready for you to take part in. There it is. So which of those dimensions has the greatest digital capability gap for your institution? Okay, you're straight into this. This is good. We have an early leader. I'm not going to tell you what it is yet. I don't want to sway you. This is super interesting as well. From when we put this together, we spoke to a lot of people about those dimensions, and what you're showing here is reflecting some of those conversations, which is awesome. The qual is speaking to the quant. Okay, so leading the pack is work and lifelong learning, varying kind of between 40 and 45%. Coming up not that far behind is learner experience, around 28, 30%. Then demand and discovery around 16%, and learning design around 13%. There's so many interesting conversations we could have just from that about what that means and why those are interesting. But certainly work and lifelong learning early on in the development piece came up as a really interesting gap and a space where people could be doing much more. So just a couple more on me. The most useful thing to do with a framework is put it to work and test what's actually happening in your organization and with your hypotheses against the framework. I'm sure it's one of many frameworks that you would use, and it's useful to see it as that. We've been working with lots of institutions around the world, particularly on the self-assessment tool related to this framework, which can be used either deep within an institution when you get 15, 20, 25 or more people to do it, and then look at how that picture looks for your institution. But also just individually, just working through the 16 domains and the definitions of those, and thinking deeply about what the digital capabilities are in your institution, how important they are, how you're currently performing, is a really great process in itself, people are telling us. And then that's being used in all kinds of things, from workshops to meetings to strategic plans and so on, to add to the other frameworks and thinking tools you're using. So with that in mind, this being the last of this series of webinars, we have already opened a Q2 benchmarking cohort. This is your time. You don't need to gather everybody together. You don't need to get permissions. We'll be sharing a link to an individual self-assessment that you'll be able to work through yourself. You can share it with other people if you'd like. And this is for our higher education network to be able to see yourselves as a cohort and to look at the digital capabilities how you're seeing your performance, your strengths, and the potential gaps in that. So look out for that coming very soon. Check your spam, you don't want to miss this one, and please do take part in it straight away, and we will get some results back to you as soon as we can. So that is it from me. I'm going to pass over to Maria, and you can start diving into the scenarios. Thank you.
Thanks, Lucy. Hi, everyone. Okay, just let's jump into scenarios. Before we jump into the actual scenarios, we need to sort of just walk through a little bit how scenarios are constructed, and in fact, even what they are. And so really very quickly, scenarios do represent sort of snapshots of a range of possible futures. Plausible, they need to be plausible, they need to be possible, but they can't be too tied down because they are about sort of future. And so really scenarios are sort of represent the different ways in which drivers, things that are happening in the world, can develop, move, the direction they go in, and the way in which they interact with each other. And so this can get quite complicated, but really there are common underlying drivers. They could go left or right, they could interact in different ways, and the result of that can move to different scenarios. But essentially scenarios should be relatively plausible, obviously different. There's a consistency to the underlying, they're internally consistent in terms of their underlying drivers and so on, and have some decision-making utility. What's the point of a scenario unless you can start thinking, if that unfolded or it went in that direction, what would that mean for us? What decisions would we make? So they can be very good decision-making tools. And of course, challenging dominant thinking around the way things are moving. And so pulling into perhaps uncomfortable directions depending on your own sort of institution's thoughts around the way things are. In terms of methodology, so HolonIQ follows a sort of three-step, it's a relatively interactive process. We identify top-down factors, so those big structural factors that move, that are shaping everything. And so firstly, top-down factors. And secondly, we build some bottom-up drivers. And this is from what's actually happening in the world. What are we seeing happening in lots of millions of different data points, essentially? How do they form uncertainties that could move one way or the other? And then, of course, the challenge is to bring those two things together in different corners to develop the scenarios. Pre-COVID, we undertook a very large project to think about what education might look like in 2030. This is education broadly, from pre-K right through the workforce learning and everything in between. And so I want to just step through a little bit some of those drivers and factors, because we applied those in this case to higher education. So firstly, the top-down methodology that I was talking about. The first stage of this 2030 project was to identify those top-down drivers: globalization and economic growth, population changes, the future of work, and advancements in technology. They are the four mega drivers that are shaping many things happening in the world, education included. So for example, we see emerging markets continuing to be an engine of growth. For population, the sort of long-term population changes, or the population sort of the way in which population is moving in different parts of the world hasn't changed too much. The impact of COVID is still very uncertain on this. Even the sort of economic growth, the COVID has and will make a big difference to the way in which economic growth around the world moves, the speed at which it moves, and which economies and where they sit with each other. COVID, of course, may have a very big change on the way in which work occurs, the future of work, and the sort of skills, and advancements in technology. Some say that the pivot of COVID has moved some advancements in technology much, much faster. Others maybe not. So they're the sort of big mega drivers that we've been looking at and applying to higher education in this case. Scenarios or change can be measured on different levels. Firstly, a whole industry structure. You can think about change to an industry. Will the way in which the whole of education is organised, in this case higher education, move and change? People don't usually think about that, they often think about the way in which learning might change. Now, these two things, of course, are connected. So big structural changes in industry and players and who delivers education and how it occurs does, of course, impact the way people learn. And conversely, the way that learners start to or like to learn can also have an impact back on the structure of the industry. In terms of the bottom up, so when we start thinking about what are those bottom up drivers that could move one way or the other, these are the sort of 16 elements that we measured on. So balance of power. In education, who has the balance of power? In which scenario? Is the government really driving change and has the power? Or is it market? Is it government-led or market-led? Is it more local or is it very global? And again, you can see how those top-down drivers might start impacting that. Is the balance of power for education more institutional or more individual? You can see how those things in different scenarios might unfold. Is it a people-led or is it more technology-led? Of course, scenarios, you will see all of these things in markets. It's not, the whole world's not going to move to one scenario or another, but you'll see different scenarios unfolding simultaneously at different parts of the world. The economics of education is very important, especially for this industry. So government investment or is it private investment? Where is the balance of power there? Is education a more elite or a more mass access? Is it more seen as a more public benefit or private good? High cost or low cost? You can see how the edges might move and how the dynamics might interact here. And the learning models, is it more theoretical or practical, on campus or online, group or individual led, instructor or self-paced? So again, thinking about those edges, those ends, can help start identifying, how scenarios might unfold. We see all of these. We see theoretical and practical on campus and online, but some of those mega drivers are changing that. We see group and individual, instructor and self-paced in everywhere in the world, but where might things move generally? And then finally, the role of technology. Is technology following? Is it a follower to learning and education, or is it actually leading? We see both at the moment. Computational power or intelligence power. Is the role of technology in education to drive efficiency and access maybe, or is it to really drive the intelligence power for learning? Digital borders or borderless data, powering process, or is it powering experience? Again, we see both of these things, but where is this heading in different scenarios? They're the sorts of bottom-up factors that we look for when we in the market to start building those different scenarios. We did this for 2030. Pat's going to run through what that process brought us to education in 2030, and then we've applied that to higher education, and we'll run through those scenarios.
Perfect. Thanks, Maria. So let me dive in and just recap on 2030, as Maria said, just as a bit of a warm-up and some context for the three scenarios for higher education. What we're looking at right here on the left-hand side, and there's some great references in the chat, is essentially a 21st century literature review using machine learning to look at 5,000 important contributions that could be from journalists, they could be from academics around the world contemplating the future of education. I know I've got some classical music joining us here, and hopefully I hit the right crescendos in the timing. I thought it'd mix it up. It's a long story. Back to the scenarios. What we did is, through the methodology and again referencing some of the conversations in the chat here, is we essentially brought together, using a very high dimensional methodology, the top-down factors, those bottom-up drivers, together with this mega machine learning literature review. What came out of that were these patterns that you can see here. Each of those is a contribution, journalist, academic, etc. They're clustered together if they're contemplating a similar future. By pushing all of those together, we came up with these 5 scenarios. And very briefly, and these are not the scenarios for higher education we're talking about today, this is a warm-up. They were education as usual, not much changes. Regional rising, which was the development of regional alliances and cooperation beyond governments. Global giants, which is very much the technology giants, but not exclusively the technology giants, taking the lead on learning. peer-to-peer, which is essentially the disintermediation of institutions in education, and learning was led by a peer-to-peer model. And then finally, advanced technology taking the lead for a robo-revolution as well. There is, at holoniq.com/2030, you'll find a free 70-page report. You'll find weeks of reading and contributions as well. But I want to touch on a very few things as we warm up for the 3 scenarios for higher ed. Just as Maria walked through those 16 drivers or uncertainties, you can see each of these scenarios was qualitatively assessed along those spectrums. We also traveled around the world back when we were allowed to jump on planes, and we essentially presented these scenarios to quite literally about 15,000 people at least in different countries around the world. And following an explanation of these scenarios, we asked them for their preference. And I'm warming you up here because we're going to ask you for your preference about the 3 scenarios Maria's going to take us through. You can see here really quickly, peer-to-peer was the dominant preferred model. That's not the model that everyone thought would unfold. It's the model that they personally, as a learner, preferred. Robo-revolution was up there. Regional rising was actually quite high as well. But then if you look in the vertical dimension, countries like France had very specific preferences, a very, very high preference for peer-to-peer and a very low preference for global giants, for example. When we dig into education as usual, remember, education in 2030 was conducted pre-COVID. And so none of us had anticipated the level of change that we're seeing now. And we're digging into the education as usual scenario for obvious reasons here. On the left was the preference by role type for education as usual. And you can see the entrepreneurs, no surprise, only 1%. This is from thousands and thousands of responses, preferred education as usual. 14% of teachers, and so that's very few teachers who actually, that's 86% of teachers did not prefer education as usual. And on the right-hand side was the probability. Now, the sobering part of this process was that actually everyone still thought it was a 50-50 chance whether education would be the same in 2030, 10 years from now, which was fascinating, a fascinating insight. When we looked at that by country, preference on the left, probability on the right, and there are very statistically significant samples under all of these, we saw a fascinating process. Finland, we started this crazy conversation on LinkedIn. There were a lot of Finns who were very unhappy that they had the highest preference for education as usual and the highest probability. But in conversation, this represented what was thought of by many from outside Finland as a system that was working relatively better than others. And so there's still only a 15% preference there for education as usual. You can see some of the larger economies around the world, China, the US, and India, in terms of still representing that same trend. Very, very low preference for education as usual, but a 50-50 probability for where they saw it happening. So let's jump into the 3 scenarios for higher education. These are not in final form, they're forming, and your involvement today will very much shape where we take these. So thinking caps on right now, be prepared to move into the poll as we start to explain these and seek your feedback and guidance on further development. We've got a pit stop though, because we are mid-COVID, we're not post-COVID, and we should just reflect briefly before we jump into those on what's happening around the world. The global economic situation has changed quite significantly. Governments were already stressed in terms of their balance sheet and spending, and they're all pumping enormous amounts of stimulus into their economies right now to reboot them mid-post-COVID, and that will see even less funding capacity from governments around the world over the next 10 years. We're seeing supply chains being repatriated by countries around the world. Brexit's happened, US-China peace has happened, Biden policies rolling out in the US. The global economic landscape's different. Population changes, some of which haven't changed a bit. Others, we're still not sure what impact the COVID will have on the birth rate around the world in different countries and what that might mean for enrollments 20 years from now, let alone things like the demographic drop that we will see in the US in the next 5 years. The future of work, I mean, none of us could imagine that a 5-day week would be considered just crazy in the office in the foreseeable future. The future of work, no one is really clear what that's going to look like. What we're clear about is it will be different. And advanced technology, we've all been preoccupied, locked up at home, insulated. Advanced tech has been charging on. VR, AR, immersive technologies have really taken a lead. Research in AI has continued. It just hasn't dominated the headlines because we've all been reading about the impact of COVID on the world. And on that note, I'm going to pause and Maria will lead us through the 3 scenarios for higher education that we're forming.
Thanks, Pat. Hi, everyone. Okay, so just before I move on to the slide, what I'm going to do is just very quickly, briefly, a shout out to each of these scenarios so that you get the feel for what the main thing is, and then we're going to deep dive into each one. Remember, these scenarios are meant to challenge. They take elements of an industry and pull it to the edges in certain directions, and they're meant to be thought-provoking. Okay, so here we go, just in terms of the 3 overview of the 3 scenarios. So scenario number 1, education state. Scenario number 2, practicum pivot. Scenario number 3, learning market. Okay, so education state. In education state, this is where universities have got the mandate for anything post-secondary. They are fully funded. Higher education is fully funded. Governments around the world say, human capital is super important. We know that now. We're going to fully fund education, and universities, you've got the mandate. There is income contingent loans or state-funded credits become the norm. B2B just explodes. B2C models in education slide backwards, and public-private partnerships are really, really strong. And so I'll go through these in a minute, but universities have the mandate. There is a catch, or there's a be careful what you wish for. So universities not only have the mandate for whole of higher education and are funded to do so, they are absolutely expected to deliver all parts in terms of jobs and skills and the whole lot. And so qualifications frameworks definitely incorporate all the micro-credentials, and there is a high expectation that universities will deliver on all of that. So that's education state. I'll go into detail in a minute. Practicum pivot. This is where actually governments and countries say universities should do R&D. That's their role. They should, revert in some cases to higher learning in terms of PhDs and research training, and they're really good at that, and that's what they should do. So they shrink in terms of their place in the market, and this is the rise of vocational education, sort of community colleges. They basically take over post-secondary education and all preparation for work in particular. Again, the 2-year degrees become sort of a norm. It's a competency-based system, right through to stacked credentials and so on, but really it is much more practical. Universities really don't play a role in that. Much more sort of apprenticeship programs, work education learning programs, industry associations, very powerful. So it's practicum pivot in post-secondary education. Scenario number 3 is learning market, and this is the completely deregulated scenario. So, this is consumer regulated. Learners make the choice. There is no real public funding in post-secondary education. So it's a free market. Incentives are geared to job outcomes, essentially. And so those providers of education that win are those that can demonstrate impact in areas that learners are interested in impact. And mainly, not always, but mainly that's about jobs. Income sharing agreements are dominant. Prices vary to fit really the sort of earning outcome or the earnings uplift that programs are able to deliver. So it is a very highly sort of innovative and changing market, because as learners seek their outcomes, providers are moving to deliver those quite fast. I'll pause there for a minute.
As Maria kind of preps to dig into each one just with a little bit more detail, please select the polls tab and put your analytical professor hat on. We're going to ask you, as we walk through each scenario, how likely you think it is that this will be the dominant scenario in 10, 15, 20 years. Time horizon per the chat is important. We're not focusing on precision so much as we're focusing on the outcome here. And so you'll be asked that analytical professor hat. At the end of that, you're going to put your mum, dad, learner, personal hat on, and you're going to answer the preference question. So hardcore analytical professor hat first, soft and friendly mum and dad learner hat second. Maria, take it away.
Okay.
I should mention, I'm going to pop the poll up a minute or so into Maria's explanation. Once you're preloaded with enough knowledge that you can make a critical assessment of the likelihood of this scenario.
Okay, so let's jump into learning state. You can see on the right-hand side the sort of the polls in those areas that I talked about before: balance of power, economics, learning model, and the role of technology. Sometimes they go. Then it's not all completely polled, but there are 2 or 3 areas there. So, for example, this is balance of power is government. They have the money. They're funding higher education. It's more local because governments in this scenario focus on economic recovery post-COVID. Their own economies are taking priority. Universities and credit institutions have the mandate, like I said before, across the whole post-secondary landscape. Fully funded. Private, public, it doesn't matter. Higher education is fully funded. In some cases, credits are provided directly to the students. Now, this happens already in some places around the world. And, so students, everyone can attend college. Everyone can attend college. This is an access. This is a high mass access rather than an elite. This would have very deep implications for many institutions as they currently sit, but also deep implications for students and learners. So the education funding industry basically collapses because nobody needs those models anymore. Funding is the lever though. So, funding allocation is closely tied to labour market needs. This is government. They want to make sure people can get into jobs. So a higher level of funding for areas in demand. Again, we see this in some places around the world, but this is now the norm for everyone. Differential funding for program length and work integrated programs. So governments are saying, well, you know what, we want people to get into X, area of work fast. We're going to fund shorter programs or micro-credential programs that lead to the right outcomes, of course, in a more higher level than a big 4-year degree, because we can't wait for that. And so whilst universities and higher education institutions are fully funded and higher education is fully funded, they use these levers. And so that has an impact. Again, these sort of models are already in place in some parts of the world. Governments use them more or less depending on what they're trying to achieve and how far they can go. But this becomes the dominant model. So it is very highly, sort of government power. Higher education institutions are required to deliver. They're funded fully. They're required to deliver in a variety of modes and lengths and levels, micro-credentials embedded within qualifications frameworks and funded accordingly. And so universities and institutions in this case don't and can't stay as they are. They must evolve. Otherwise, of course, there's funding implications. Private training market pretty much disappears. Workers upskill and reskill through their accredited programs, through their micro-credentials, higher education institutions using their credits. International education would slow. Governments in this scenario are interested in their economy, but bilateral and multilateral arrangements are in place between trade partners or trade blocs and so on. So international education would be would change significantly, potentially, out of this scenario. So
We've just opened the. Sorry, Maria.
Yeah,
I've just opened the. I've just opened the poll.
Oh.
So please, you've got plenty of context there for this first scenario. Analytical hat on. How likely is the learning state scenario? Are you almost certain that this is how higher education will play out? Or do you think this scenario is really a 50-50? Do you think actually probably not? I believe that we'll head in a different direction. Or do you think that it's just completely highly unlikely? We put some kind of probabilistic estimates there next to those those descriptive words, but please jump in right now. There are hundreds of you as part of this, and we're really looking forward to your guidance. Hit the polls tab on the right-hand side.
The other thing to note about learning state is that if you're in EdTech, B2C education, like servicing students, B2C is much less viable. It sort of doesn't exist. These players are pivoting to B2B to service institutions because institutions are innovating their own models, and they need to be serviced in areas where they don't have the skills and so on. So B2C sort of collapses. B2B supporting institutions skyrockets. I think we're pausing on this poll.
Jump in, please contribute now. And we're about to move to the next scenario.
Are we reading out these polls now, Patrick, or moving forward?
Yeah, go for it.
All right, so probably not is the highest. Probably not. Most people think 40% of people thinking no, probably not, but 22% thinking it's probable. Okay, and highly unlikely 13%. So this is interesting. People do not think that scenario number one is a probable scenario.
There's still, yeah, it's interesting. Sorry, Maria. There's a bit of a bias to probably not, but there's still 50-50 is actually the third highest. So what 80% of the options are straddling 50-50 with a bias to probably not. We'll share these as part of the feedback loop for your
feedback. Scenario number two is Practicum Pivot. This is where the post-secondary market sort of bifurcates. Universities revert to focusing on their academic and scientific research. They pretty much cease their involvement in education for the professions. You don't need to go to university to be an accountant or do marketing or something. Universities become much more closely aligned with industrial research. Education at universities is limited to research degrees with less than 10% of the population attending universities. I mean, this is sort of back to the future in a way, 50, 60, 70 years ago. So they are much more aligned in the research area. The vocational sector vastly expands. This is vocational institutes, community colleges. They become the sought-after vehicle for higher learning and career outcomes. In this scenario, many universities, community colleges, vocational institutes morph into these institutes of higher learning. And so this has a big impact on the sort of structure of the industry. Those institutes are completely unencumbered, pretty much unencumbered by research targets and rankings and so on. They focus on programs designed to produce job-ready graduates, taking over vocational and professional education, servicing like 70% of the population in this case. So this sort of splits much more, stratifies or splits the higher education sector. 2-year degrees, competency-based learning is dominant, strong industry partnerships, work and learn programs, revitalisation of apprenticeships, cadetship models, etc. Like multi-year full-time campus-based study is pretty rare. Most learning now occurs in the context of work. And the focus of policy and funding is sort of much more practical on productivity and output. And so this is a real, move towards sort of, it's horses for courses. Universities become more research, and vocational and community colleges take over the post-secondary and higher education landscape.
So please jump in. The poll is live. Jump to the polls tab if you haven't already. How likely is a Practicum Pivot scenario? We've had some awesome conversation in the chat about whether this applies globally, regionally, or by country. Absolutely, there will be big differences there. At one level, we'd like to see what you think the dominant model would be globally. Of course, this will vary very significantly by country and by region as well, but we are also seeing a globalization of higher education as well, specifically in the practicum kind of area with global employers and global trends. So please jump in. You are making a massive difference to the future shape of these scenarios.
So far, a third of people are saying this is probable. This sort of scenario, and another 30% are saying it's a 50-50 likelihood. And That's super interesting. I mean, one of the things to say about scenarios, of course, is the whole world is not going to move to one or the other. We are going to see all these scenarios operating in different ways in different parts of the world. But, there is a dominant model now. And so we're interested in the dominant model, even though we know there's going to be all of them operating in some way or another. We're seeing Practicum Pivot in some countries right now, and we're also seeing Education State also already free higher education in some other countries. Okay, moving to learning market. Learning market is, with the sort of backdrop of global hyper competition, technology advancements, it's a deregulated market. Like many other public sector, pre-public sector areas, government has completely deregulated post-secondary education and turns to the market to drive innovation. Governments can no longer afford and want to deregulate in order to move innovation forward. And so, this is a relatively sort of scary scenario potentially. Learners are agnostic in this scenario to public or private, local or global. I mean, they're going to go with the best thing for them and what gives them outcomes. And so, providers, all different provider types, whether it be historically an education institution or a global giant delivering some technology course, it's a globally competitive market, education and training, all sorts of credentials. What we see in this is huge efficiencies, a very, very huge cost reduction. So the cost of education, higher education, goes way down, brought about by this sort of hyper competition, technology advancement, and so on. Income share agreements are the dominant funding source, but prices vary, of course, to fit the outcomes. So in this scenario, there's sort of high social acceptance of flexible building blocks for learning. It gains traction following employer endorsements. Employers endorsing certain, models lead to learners moving to those models. And recognition focuses on outcomes rather than necessarily provider brand. Those two things become sort of decoupled compared with now. Companies play a much greater role in education. They see their efforts in this domain as a talent attraction, talent retention mechanism with clear links to economic impact. Education regulatory bodies are more like ombudsman type role than compared with now, and micro-credentials are absolutely the norm in this global open market. Again, we're seeing this model already in many sort of elements of post-secondary education. But in this scenario, the learning market will become the dominant sort of model. So let's jump into the voting here and submit your vote there. Okay, so we're neck and neck, probable. 25, a quarter of you are thinking, okay, it's changing fairly rapidly. 30% probable, and another 30% 50-50 likelihood. It is difficult to say, yeah, that is definitely going to happen. At the moment, we're seeing, a third saying it's probable, 75% likelihood that the higher education market will deregulate and become a much more sort of open market.
I think as we get those last few assessments on learning market, my very quick read is Practicum Pivot has only just beat learning market from a likelihood perspective. Only just, it's really close. And learning state is actually quite far behind those two, which are very close together. So please jump in. As you're jumping in for learning state, let me just warm you up on this next question. Okay, so professor, analytical hat off, learner, personal. You're thinking about family, you're thinking about economic security, you're thinking about upskilling yourself and your loved ones. And as we transition to that question, we're very specifically, I'm sending this live now, asking you which scenario is your personal preference. So as a learner, thinking of family, thinking of, you know, yourself, your future as a learner, which world would you prefer? Which scenario would you prefer? Pretty fascinating early results, and we've had much higher engagement on this question. Please keep jumping in. This is making a massive contribution to the evolution of this thinking. You want to do the honors, Maria?
Yeah, so, you know, we have 50% of the audience saying, you know, Practicum Pivot is my personal preference. And that's interesting. I guess people on the call here today are from all different parts of higher education, working at universities and other places too. But Practicum Pivot is the clear winner. Well, clear winner. Learning market, the sort of much more deregulated, is still 40%. And so those two, there's something about those two, or the mix of those two, that's of you know, attracting people. Yeah. All right. Let's jump into, we've got a few more minutes. What we wanted to do here is to get your thoughts on, in higher education, what do you think is the top, or the top one or two factors or drivers which are really most likely to define and divide future scenarios? So if they went left, higher education might look like this, or if they went right, higher education might look like that. Those, you know, sort of key factors. One, I mean, the top thing that's going to turn the dial on which way higher education might go. And this is really just in the chat. We just wanted to give you an opportunity to say, well, you know, it's going to be government funding, or it's going to be technology, or whatever it may be. It might be work, the future of work, or, you know, whatever it might be. So really super interested. There's, you know, you can see them in the chat because this is in the chat. Just put in what you're thinking. So economics is you know, the first one jumping in there. And obviously the economics of education does make a massive difference to how things unfold and the shape and structure of a market.
Quickly, sorry, Maria.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, if we were having a cup of coffee, I'd be probably asking you, you know, what does it really come down to? Like, what is it that we need to study and really understand, that the outcome of which fundamentally drives different scenarios? And thank you so much. We're getting some awesome content.
Yeah, so, you know, the funding, employability, future of work, skills gap. I mean, I would agree that's a very, very significant driver. And technology too, and infrastructure to do with technology, I can see coming through there. Yeah, awesome. Funding models, huge. The way in which governments or individuals or companies decide to fund learning and education.
Maybe just as a comment as we wrap up, I know we're coming on time. This is a complex area. Building scenarios is a complex task. Scenarios are not meant to be a one-size-fits-all process. And I think of anyone, this audience here appreciates that it is a highly iterative and interactive process too. So we are going to incorporate all of this feedback to improve these scenarios, and you know, consult our global higher education network as part of that as well. So thank you everybody for these contributions. This is enormous.
Excellent. Really, really fascinating. Can't wait to read back through the chat and go back through those answers, because there was so much rich content in there. I know we're at time, so I'm going to quickly wrap this up. This is sadly and also kind of excitingly the last session of our 6-part part 1, but don't worry, there's more to come. We'll be following up with lots of great information about how else you can keep track of the conversations that are to come. The best way to stay up to date on all the things we're doing in this space is to join the Global Higher Education Network. If you haven't done so already, please do that as soon as you jump off. It's a really great way to stay up to date. You can fill out the self-assessment. You can just tons of great insights through that. And also we'll be reaching out in a couple of weeks about the Q2 benchmarking cohort. Do make sure that that doesn't get stuck in your spam, drag it out and bring it into your inbox if so. And yeah, really excited to continue the conversation with everybody. Thanks again for your amazing insights. And thank you, Maria, Lucy, and Patrick.
Thanks, Beth. Bye, everyone.
Thanks. Bye.